Chapter 33. Mud. The child sat crying in the mud. Her blonde hair was in tangles around her face. The girl wept quietly, with a resignation that was wrong for such a young child. Children were supposed to be pugnacious and indignant in the presence of awfulness. Daria watched her, listening for what to do. Where were the parents? These people were still wary of the priestesses, but they were now respectful for the sake of Marcus. She didn't want to offend them by getting too close to their daughter, but the daughter needed help. Daria didn't want to ponder the child's despair any further. She only wanted to focus on the possibility of this girl crying and eventually laughing like a normal girl again. She wanted to imagine these people thriving again. The thought of it getting worse sent shudders through her heart. It was an image that threatened to make her one of the haunted, too. Daria stepped a few feet from the child and squatted. She looked into the girl's face and smiled. The girl bared glossy, bloodshot blue eyes at her, then sniffed and shuddered. Daria looked at her hands. She looked back at the child and then sunk her hands into the mud. It was cold and soft with tiny pebbles embedded in it. She ran her hands across the top and patted it flat. With her fingers she poked 2 dots and an upturned arc beneath them. A smile. She heard the child's sniffling cease and felt the girl's weary eyes watching her. Daria smoothed the wet mud flat again and then drew a tree. Next to the tree she drew the longhouse. It was whole, undamaged. Then she began to draw people next to it. Daria paused and looked up at the child, whose face was now completely overtaken with curiosity. The girl leaned forward, looking at the drawing in the mud. She reached out a finger and lightly touched the lines. Her hands grazed the mud and moved up above the longhouse. She pressed her finger in and drew a circle, then another. She poked dots in the center of each circle and then lines for sinister brows. Next, she drew a large hand underneath and then began drawing another that moved down over the longhouse. Daria noticed the child's face tightening and growing paler. The finger was going deeper and deeper into the mud until finally it reached the longhouse. The child thrust her hand deep into the muck, pulled out a handful, and with a scream, threw it forcefully against the wall of a nearby cabin. Then she began to shake with noisy, angry sobs. "That's better," whispered Daria. She looked down at the mutilated longhouse and up at the eyes and hands that must have been the demon. With quick movements of her large hands, she made it all smooth again. Then she closed her eyes and recalled the day the demon had nearly destroyed them in the field. She remembered the prayer circle, the flying dirt. Then she saw the demon's visage, its roiling features, angry, vacuous eyes, and violent mouth. She placed her finger into the mud and began to draw the demon from memory. Behind her, she found a twig that she used to fill in finer details. She called up all her skills of shading and definition until she had worked a full relief of the demon in the mud. The girl stayed quiet beside her the whole time. When Daria finished, she looked down at the child, who stared shakily in a kind of fear-soaked wonder. Daria sensed the girl going back to the day the demon attacked, the day the longhouse had been ripped open right in front of her. Daria imagined what the noise must have been like and the utter hopelessness that filled the hearts of everyone who kept her safe. The priestess heard a sniffling behind her. She turned around and looked into the faces of an array of children that had somberly gathered while she was working. Their curiosity mixed with confused desolation. Their faces, too, were tired and soiled, their eyes grief-stricken and bloodshot. Daria stood up and took them all in. They kept staring at her perfect rendering of the demon. She looked down at it and bent over, sunk her hand deep into the mud in the middle of the demon's face, and then with all her strength, hurled the muck through 2 cabins into a stand of trees. The children understood immediately. They pounced on the image in the ground like a pack of wolves on prey. They clutched at the mud, grabbing fistfuls and hurling it in all directions. They screamed and yelled and growled with every thrust, every clump of flying dirt. Daria watched them, her heart expanding as she felt their anger, their defiance, their indignation, their childlike vitality. Suddenly, all remaining traces of the demon were gone. The children began to slow down until they stood ankle-deep in the churned-up mud. Splatters of it arrayed their faces, which were now pink where the mud was not covering. Their eyes shone with vigor, with life. Daria beamed at them. They grinned back with toothy smiles. Then she saw several of the children look beyond her. She turned and beheld a group of adults standing around them. She nodded in deference and consciously tried not to wince at their haggard appearances. Daria didn't know how long they had been there. Maybe they had seen her mud relief of the demon. Maybe they had not. She decided to do it again. She knelt down and smoothed the wet mud flat. Then she summoned up the demon in her mind's eye and began reforming the image in the mud. She felt everyone gather close behind her, watching intently. She gave herself time to get every detail correct and to heighten the violent ferocity of the demon. When she was done, she stood up and backed away. All the children stood quietly, looking at the adults. Nobody moved. Then the young girl who first threw the mud stepped forward, scooped up a handful from the demon's face, and carried it over to her mother. The woman held out her hands as the girl dropped the muck into them. The woman looked down at her hands for several minutes. Then she stepped forward and with a tearful gasp, hurled the mud away into the trees. Everyone watched quietly as she stepped over to stand next to her daughter. Daria held her breath. The moment had become extremely delicate, fragile. The raucous zeal of the children had faded into the somber grief of the adults. A man stepped forward, scooped mud off the demon's image, and hefted it up toward the tops of the trees. The mud scattered and hit the high, short boughs with satisfying wisps. The sound faded into silence. Daria kept still. Another man stepped forward and with a loud growl did the same. Again, silence. One after another, each adult came forward, eroding away the image of the demon with every hurled heap. It was a ritual, Daria thought, in which the villagers were casting out the demon from their midst. Then they were finished. They all stood pensively as the afternoon sun peered through the overcast sky. Mud covered the nearby cabins, the children, and the nearby stand of trees. Some of the adults' faces were wet with tears. Daria was unsure what to do. She wondered what Sophia might do in this situation. She quickly cast around and saw Sophia, Cleo, Lydia, and Marcus watching her from beside the ruined longhouse. They nodded to her. Daria turned back to the expectant faces of the villagers. "Let's all smooth out the mud again," she said. The villagers fell forward on their knees, reaching out to pat the mud beside each other, the big and small hands, together in the moist earth. Then they stood back and waited expectantly. Daria stepped forward and knelt down. The emerging sun had made the mud a little more stiff, which was perfect to create a deeper relief. She began to outline the figure of the little girl giving the mud to her mother, the child's hands and the adult hands, the woman looking down at her daughter. When the two recognized themselves, they exclaimed to each other with laughter. Daria looked up and smiled. "Come," she said. "What have you seen that you want to remember?" The children jumped forward and began drawing trees, stars, and the sun. A few adults moved in and began to run lines in the mud. One man made the double arc of a bird in flight. Another simply drew lines, watching the marks made by his hands. Gradually, everyone was kneeling over the moist, transforming earth. When they had filled the smoothed area, they moved further down to more space to draw more pictures. All afternoon they worked, filling the streets with images of what was beautiful, what was important, what was good. Chapter 34. Colors. Belderon ran his finger across the rough surface of the frozen riverbank. Glints of goldfish twinkled abundantly before him. It was now nearly dark, and he was warm and full. Stars twinkled in the clear Arctic night. He scanned the trees across the river. Their red leaves made a deep blood color in the late dusk light. He squatted on a low stone at the edge of the frozen mud flats. He wasn't tired. He certainly could keep going, but now he wasn't sure why. He had been hiking up this river for days, and there was no trace of Thervius. Should he be hiking in the other direction? No. His gut said no. But all this river gave him was the interminable expanse of itself. It went on, a grand confluence even despite its recessed banks. At home, Thervius knew every stream on his mountain. He knew where the icy trickle above the tree line gave way to silky rivulets of water. These flowed through the forest ever more confidently to the valley river that was as wide as their village longhouse. Belderon had been impressed with its size. He relished the rock pools that were deep enough for him to be fully submerged on a warm summer day. In contrast, this river was ominous in its size. Their trip across the ocean channel had prepared him for vastness, but the enduring length and width of this river was causing him to doubt. Would it end, or even begin to narrow? His heart sank. He missed Thervius. The darkness around him emphasized his isolation, and it almost became too painful to bear. Belderon looked up into the sky to see if he could recognize the constellations. The night was saturated with stars. He had never seen so many. There were too many to even make out the distinct constellations. He let himself be entranced by the starlight. It flooded him with calm elation. It took his mind off the river. He blinked. So much light, he whispered to himself. Then something shifted into the edge of his vision. It was a string of multicolored lights moving across the sky. He stood up, as if his body's height might give him a closer look. First, there was something blue, sparks of blue the same color as the veins in the rock. Then there were moving sparks of red, then yellow, then purple. Belderon counted the colors until he reached 23 distinct hues. What were they? They couldn't be stars which shot across the heavens. These sparks of light moved at the pace of an eagle high up in the heavens. Then suddenly a massive torch of flame flared across the night. Shortly after, flames issued forth from each of the moving sparks. It lit up the sky, and it lit up the source of the colored lights. Dragons, gasped Belderon. In all the light, he could make out their wings, their long necks, and their graceful tails. Dragons were known to appear in people's dreams, and it wasn't believed that they actually existed. Belderon had dreamt of them enough to recognize them. Even Helga would spin an adventure story full of dragons, if coaxed enough. But supposedly that was as real as they were, until now. The line of lights began to circle in the sky and then head back down the river. They sailed away as beautifully as they had come. Belderon watched them until they disappeared. Now he couldn't keep still. He wanted to fly with them. He wanted to know every brilliant color forever. His eyes remained dazzled by the multi-hued sparks and the torches of fire. His heart was aflame. He turned and looked back up the river, the long path that had yet not given him his heart's desire. It lay still and dark. The waters rushed indifferently past him, but he was here, he was alive. The same withholding path had also fed him and kept him warm. He had been given the strength to keep going. Clearly, This is what he was meant to do. Belderon recalled the singing tones, the lighted footprints, the moving rock. He wasn't just traveling. This land was moving him forward. This mystical land literally moved for him. How dare he not trust what he couldn't see? Belderon peered up the river. He strode forward into the darkness. His eyes saw nothing, but his heart beheld a light, a sense of the one he loved, and a promise from everything around him. There would be no sleeping tonight. Chapter 35. Brothers. Janku looked at the bare, glowing back of his brother, who marched swiftly in front of him. The two men hiked down the river together, Thervius and Janku, who had been remembered into flesh. They had nothing on them to keep them warm. They coursed comfortably with the magic heat of the fish, which emanated a sustaining warmth from within them. Thervius talked as he walked, recounting all the details of the journey since the oracle reading that told him of his destiny. He talked about leaving the farm, camping into the mountains, finding the settlement, and meeting Belderon. He talked about the Heartlight, their journey to the coast, the boat they made, and the icy shores of this icy continent. Janku listened quietly. He let the knowledge melt into understanding, which quieted his mind before the great mystery of his own presence here. He remembered the farm, the field, his unbearable anger. After that there was nothing, just a big shadow that turned into the frigid darkness of this world, and then the presence of his glowing brother, gazing back at him, then feeding him. Something in his world had slipped back into place. Thervius was here. Now they would find their way home. Though somewhere along the way they had to find the one Thervius loved. There had been a Heartlight. Janku knew they had to be reunited. As this thought entered Janku's mind, Thervius got to the part where he last remembered Belderon. The last thing he remembered was walking in the snow. Then there was nothing. Then he woke up atop a high mountain with wolves made of ice. Life had changed as he knew it. 1 minute he was alone, and then he was with his brother. 1 minute Thervius was with his beloved, and then he wasn't. They were phenomena that defied his farmer's mind. These weren't the straight rows he had made in the soil at the same time every year. The line got broken and then continued somewhere else. There was so much Janku couldn't explain, and it all began when he couldn't explain to himself why his brother had left the farm. The confusion had ignited a fury within him, something he sensed that had transformed his whole world and beyond. It was more than just the fact that he was now on an entirely different and very strange continent. He looked at Thervius, who was in the process of telling him everything, the whole truth. Why hadn't he trusted his young brother? Why didn't he believe it would all work out? The field would be planted, his brother would return. But it was another one of those mysteries he couldn't understand. Thervius had left, and as far as he knew, brothers didn't leave. Maybe it was jealousy. Had he himself wanted to leave, to break free of his duty? If this had been his desire, it had indeed happened. Exactly how, he had no idea. What he did know, now more than ever, is that he wanted to go home. He didn't belong here, and he worried for his parents. He wanted to build on the life he already had. Perhaps somewhere, sometime, there would be a Heartlight for him too, someone with whom he would share his life as a farmer, the life he wanted back. Janku? Thervius turned around, his face alight. He had been chatting the whole time, lost in the familiarity of talking to his brother. His face held all the trust and zeal that Janku knew from their boyhood. Yes? What if we started collecting fish, then headed east toward the shore? I know I could find the boat from there. Perhaps Belderon is going that direction. It is likely. We both know where the boat is. That makes sense. Let's do it. They both stopped and looked around. The fish glittered abundantly in the bank. but the confluence was wide and swift. How will we get across? Thervius mused intently. Janku ran through the obvious solutions. We could make a raft, or was there a place up the river we could cross? There was a long, long time ago, sighed Thervius. It is too far back. Janku turned around and looked up into the trees. A light snow dusted his short, dark hair. There were evergreens, along with mysterious white-barked trees with red, heart-shaped leaves. If there were any fallen logs, they had long been covered with snow. Thervius, let's explore in the forest. Perhaps we'll find something to make a raft. Yes, replied Thervius. He thought of the tall, wide grass, and the golden fish, and the tiny trees at the top of the mountain. They may not find wood, but he was willing to believe something else existed that would work. The two brothers left the mud bank and entered the forest. Their bare feet sunk into the soft snow. Both of the men could feel its softness, but none of the cold. They walked around the bases of tall pine and cedar with expansive boughs. They peered over the blue veins of lapis lazuli that ran through the boulders. They picked up whole nuggets of turquoise and gripped them in their hands, feeling the heft of so much color before setting them back down. Suddenly snow started to descend. Night was also falling, and they both started to get hungry and slightly chilled. It's time to eat, said Thervius as he stepped out into a clear night under the stars. Both of them pulled the frozen fish from the bank and ate quietly, the golden flesh assuaging both the hunger and the chill. Thervius? Yes? This place is so beautiful. Do you think the priestesses know about it? I don't know. I don't think so. They would have told us about it, I think. They both went down to the bank and grabbed more fish. Tell me about Belderon? Yes, Belderon. Thervius sighed and closed his eyes. He looked for his lover in his mind's eye. He saw him right away. He is very strong, the same height as me. Sometimes he is a little quiet, serious. He really knows the mountains of his homeland. He loves the trees and all the rocks and the rivers. He is loyal. I know he's looking for me. Janku listened quietly. He chewed slowly. Quiet is good, because you sure talk a lot. Thervius grinned and shoved Janku from the side. Janku fell, laughing, into the soft snow. His skin was hot and the snow melted around him, making it a little slippery getting back up. Suddenly an idea flooded his mind. Hey, Thervius, he said, if we eat enough of this fish, we could be warm enough to swim across. Janku, Thervius bolted up. You're right. The current is swift, but we're both good swimmers. We've been swimming in the ocean all our lives. Janku thought a moment. But I think we should have a rope. There should be a rope between us. That way we can pull for each other if the current takes one of us. I agree, said Thervius, and he paused. The tall river grass. Perhaps we can braid one from the blades? Janku walked down the bank toward a stand of grass and ran his hands down them. They are tough, he said. Let's get some sleep and make them in the morning. They both began pulling blades for their beds. They settled into snowy bowers, and in minutes both were fast asleep. The next morning they rose, ate, and set to work. They pulled more blades, splitting them into thin strips with their hands. Then they wove them together into a long, narrow net. It was how the fishermen on the southern coast had made their fishing nets. They both had learned it as boys and decided now it was the best way to make a rope that would hold. By the afternoon they had finished. They both stood at either end, pulling and pulling, testing it for strength. It held. Well, said Janku, let's go swimming. They walked down to the water with the rope net over their shoulders. They crouched and picked up fish as they walked, prying out the flesh and stuffing it into their mouths. By the time they reached the water's edge, they both burned with heat. They each slipped it into the water. They immediately felt the tug of the current, but none of the cold. Steam danced where their skin touched the water. Each man looped the rope around his waist. They were now bound to share the same outcome of the crossing. Either they both succeeded or they both failed. They looked at one another, gave a grin, and plunged in. Each swam diagonally up into the current as it fiercely pushed at them downward. "Short strokes," yelled Janku. They each fell into a vigorous paddle, keeping their arms close to their bodies and leveraging their elbows against their rib cages. Throwing out their arms, they would get spun around by the current. Steam floated from their bodies into the air. Thervius thrust forward, fighting into the deeper parts. From all his days of running, his lungs were expanded and strong. Oxygen coursed to all his muscles, and he churned through the water successfully. But then he felt a tug at his waist. Janku was not keeping up. His newly remembered body didn't have the strength. Thervius thrust forward, hoping that he would pull Janku along. He couldn't see him in the rapids, and the roar was too strong to hear his voice. Suddenly the rope slackened around his waist. Either Janku was swimming, or the rope had broken. Thervius spun around wildly, but he couldn't see anything. His face was pummeled with steamy water. A wave caught him and pushed him under. The rope tightened around his waist again. Janku was there. Thervius kicked up and resurfaced. He pushed toward the shore. At last, his flailing feet hit the bottom. Hard. He stood up and rushed toward the shallows. Then he turned and began pulling on the rope. He saw Janku's limp body coming toward him. His head was face down in the water. He grabbed at his brother and turned him over. Thervius screamed, "Janku!" Janku spit and gasped for air. Thervius pulled him up the bank. They both lay at the water's edge as dusk fell. Janku fell into a deep sleep, while Thervius looked back over the churning river, amazed at what they had done.